Welcome to Empathy Stories, where we explore tales that move the heart and remind us of the power of compassion and resilience. Today, we delve into the courageous journey of Lily, a brave young girl who stood against injustice to protect her stepbrother Ethan, transforming her family's darkest moments into a story of healing and hope. In a quaint suburban home tucked away in a quiet American neighborhood, life was anything but peaceful for young Ethan. From the outside, the house seemed idyllic, with its well-kept lawn and flower beds brimming with life. But behind closed doors, secrets festered, and silence hung heavily over the family. Ethan, a 14-year-old boy with soft brown eyes and a shy demeanor, sat stiffly at the dining table one evening. His plate of food lay untouched, but his stepmother, Mrs. Harper, sat across from him, glaring with a piercing intensity. Her voice, sharp and unforgiving, broke the tense silence. "Ethan, how many times must I tell you not to slouch?" she barked, her words landing like a slap. "You're 14, not 4. Sit up straight." Ethan's shoulders sagged further, his face a mask of practiced indifference. He had learned that responding only made things worse. At the other end of the table, Lily, his 12-year-old stepsister, flinched at Mrs. Harper's tone, her small hands gripping her spoon tightly. The tension in the air was palpable. Yet Mr. Scott, their father, remained oblivious. Engrossed in his phone, dinner was a performance, a carefully choreographed facade of normalcy. Mr. Scott's silence provided Mrs. Harper with the cover she needed to maintain control over the household. But Lily, young as she was, saw through the act. She had grown protective of Ethan, noticing the signs of his quiet suffering, the hollow look in his eyes, the way his shoulders curled inward as if trying to make himself invisible. Later that evening, Lily found Ethan sitting alone on the steps outside, staring at the darkening sky. She sat beside him, her heart aching as she noticed the fresh red marks on his arms. Faint but unmistakable. "Ethan," she began softly, her voice trembling with concern. "You have to tell Dad. He needs to know what's happening." Ethan shook his head, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "He won't believe me," he whispered. "He never does." Lily's chest tightened at the resignation in his voice. She reached out and placed a hand on his arm. "You don't deserve this," she said firmly, her voice thick with unshed tears. "None of this is your fault." Ethan turned to her, his dark eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and fear. "Don't make it worse for yourself, Lily," he murmured. "Please." But Lily couldn't ignore what she saw. Each bruise, every faint scar, and every tear Ethan refused to cry fueled her determination. That night, as the wind whistled through the trees, Lily made a silent vow. If no one else would fight for Ethan, she would. The next morning, Lily awoke to the muffled sound of coughing. She rushed into the hallway and found Ethan struggling to carry a stack of freshly ironed clothes to Mrs. Harper's bedroom. His face was pale, and his arms trembled under the weight. "She made you do the laundry again?" Lily asked, her voice low but laced with anger. Ethan nodded, avoiding her gaze. "She said I didn't clean the kitchen well enough yesterday. This is my punishment." The flatness in his tone, the sheer acceptance of his plight, made Lily's heart ache. She took the pile of clothes from his hands and set it down on a nearby table. "This isn't right, Ethan," she whispered fiercely. "You're not a servant." Ethan glanced at her, his eyes flashing with a mixture of gratitude and fear. "Don't make her angrier," he pleaded, his voice barely audible. Lily watched him disappear down the hall, her small fists clenched at her sides. Her helplessness boiled into anger. How could their father not see what was happening? How could he let Mrs. Harper get away with this cruelty? That afternoon, Lily found Ethan sitting outside again, hiding his hands in his lap. She crouched beside him and gently took his hands, wincing at the sight of his swollen knuckles. "What happened?" she demanded. "She said I folded the shirts wrong," Ethan muttered, his voice laced with a pain he tried to hide. Lily felt tears prick her eyes, but she quickly blinked them away. "This has to stop," she said quietly, her voice trembling with emotion. Ethan shook his head. Dad won't believe us. He loves her. Lily's jaw tightened, and a spark of defiance lit in her chest. He'll believe me, she said, her voice steady with determination. He has too. That evening, Lily gathered her courage and approached her father during dinner. Mr. Scott sat in his usual spot, flipping through a newspaper while Mrs. Harper hummed in the kitchen. Ethan sat silently, pushing peas around his plate. Dad, Lily began, her voice firm despite the nervous flutter in her chest. I need to talk to you about something important. Mr. Scott glanced at her over his glasses, raising an eyebrow. What is it, Lily? She hesitated, stealing a glance at Ethan. He shook his head slightly, silently begging her to stop. Ignoring his plea, Lily pressed on. It's about Ethan. Mrs. Harper, she's hurting him. The words hung in the air like a thundercloud. Mr. Scott put down his newspaper, his expression turning serious. That's a strong accusation. Lily, what are you talking about? Lily leaned forward, her small fist clenched. She makes him do all the chores. And she hits him. I've seen the bruises. At that moment, Mrs. Harper appeared in the doorway, a saccharine smile plastered on her face. Lily, what nonsense are you talking about now? She asked sweetly, though her eyes glinted with annoyance. Mr. Scott sighed, rubbing his temples. Lily, I think you've misunderstood. Your mother is strict, but she only wants what's best for you and Ethan. She's not my mother, Lily snapped, her voice rising with frustration. And she's not doing what's best for anyone. Enough, Mr. Scott said sharply, his tone brooking no argument. Apologize to your mother. Lily stormed out of the room, tears stinging her eyes. If her father wouldn't listen, she realized with a heavy heart, she would have to find another way. Ethan needed her now more than ever. As she paced her room that night, frustration and anger churned within her. The silence in their family was suffocating, but Lily was determined to shatter it. She would not let Ethan suffer alone. The night after her father dismissed her, Lily sat alone in her room, the dim glow of her bedside lamp illuminating the small notebook in her hands. She flipped through its empty pages, her mind racing. If her father wouldn't believe her words, she needed to show him the truth. Each bruise on Ethan's arms and each harsh word from Mrs. Harper replayed in her mind like a haunting refrain. Determined, she picked up her pen and began to write, documenting every moment she had witnessed of her stepmother's cruelty. The next morning, Lily woke to the sound of Mrs. Harper's sharp voice echoing through the house. She peeked out of her room and saw Ethan hunched over a mop bucket in the hallway, scrubbing the floor with shaky hands. His face was pale, his movements slow, and Lily's heart twisted at the sight. She made you clean the floors again? Lily whispered when Mrs. Harper stepped away. Ethan nodded, avoiding her gaze. I didn't scrub the bathroom well enough yesterday, he muttered, his voice devoid of energy. Lily's fists clenched. This isn't right. Ethan, she said fiercely, placing her hand on his shoulder. You don't deserve this. Ethan looked up at her, his dark eyes filled with both gratitude and fear. Don't make it worse, he pleaded softly. She'll just get angrier. But Lily wasn't deterred. As soon as Mrs. Harper disappeared into another room, Lily grabbed her tablet from her desk and began recording. She captured the scorn in Mrs. Harper's voice as she berated Ethan for not working fast enough, her sharp commands slicing through the air like daggers. Every insult, every unreasonable demand, it was all there. Later that afternoon, Lily caught Ethan sitting outside again, his hands hidden in his lap. When she gently pulled them into view, her breath caught. His knuckles were swollen and red, a clear sign of the punishment he had endured. What happened this time, she asked, her voice trembling with anger. She said I didn't fold the shirts properly. Ethan muttered, avoiding her gaze. Tears stung Lily's eyes, but she quickly blinked them away. This has to stop, she said, her voice steady. Dad might not want to listen, but I'll find a way to make him see. Ethan shook his head, his voice barely above a whisper. He loves her. Lily, he won't believe you. Lily's jaw tightened as she placed her hands on her hips. Then I'll give him something he can't ignore. The following days were a blur of quiet observation and careful planning. Lily carried her tablet with her everywhere, hiding it under her sweater as she captured moments of Mrs. Harper's mistreatment. One afternoon, she crouched behind the staircase as Mrs. Harper scolded Ethan for spilling a glass of water. "You're useless," Mrs. Harper snapped, her voice sharp and cutting. "Just like your mother." Lily's heart pounded as she recorded from the shadows. She watched as Mrs. Harper raised her hand as if to strike Ethan. Stopping just short, Lily's hands trembled, but she kept the camera steady, capturing every second. When the moment passed, she slipped away unnoticed, her determination growing stronger with every piece of evidence she gathered. That evening, Lily decided it was time to confront her father again. She waited until Ethan had gone to bed and Mrs. Harper was occupied in the kitchen, holding the tablet tightly in her hands. She approached her father, who was seated in the living room with his laptop. "Dad," she said, her voice steady but urgent, "I need you to watch something." Mr. Scott sighed, barely glancing up. "Lily, I'm busy. Can this wait?" "No, it can't," she insisted, placing the tablet on the coffee table. Before he could protest, she pressed play. The room filled with the sound of Mrs. Harper's sharp voice, the venom in her words cutting through the quiet. Mr. Scott's expression shifted from mild irritation to shock as he watched the footage of Mrs. Harper berating Ethan, her hand poised to strike him. When the video ended, Mr. Scott sat back in his chair, his face pale. This can't be right," he stammered. "There must be some explanation." "There is," Lily said firmly, her voice trembling with emotion. "She's been abusing Ethan, and you've been ignoring it. I've tried to tell you, but you wouldn't listen." Before Mr. Scott could respond, Mrs. Harper entered the room, her cheerful facade faltering when she saw the tension in the air. "What's going on here?" she asked, her tone sharp. "I showed Dad the truth," Lily said, meeting her stepmother's glare with defiance. Mrs. Harper's smile tightened, her eyes flashing with anger. "You've misunderstood again, Lily," she said sweetly, though her voice carried an edge. "I'm strict because I care. This isn't caring, it's cruel." Lily shot back, her hands trembling but her resolve unwavering. "And I'm not staying silent anymore." Mrs. Harper's icy glare sent a chill through Lily, but she didn't back down. The silence that followed was deafening, and for a brief moment, Lily thought she saw guilt flicker across her father's face. Yet his response fell short. "I'll handle it," Mr. Scott said finally, his voice hesitant. Lily's chest tightened with frustration. She had given him undeniable evidence, and still, he hesitated. That night, as she sat on her bed, the weight of her father's inaction pressed heavily on her. She glanced at the tablet beside her, her resolve hardening. If her father wouldn't act, she would. Someone had to protect Ethan, and she refused to let him down. The next day, Lily made a decision. She approached the one adult she knew she could trust, her school counselor, Mrs. Elliott. Taking a deep breath, she knocked on the counselor's door, tablet in hand. It was time to take the fight for justice beyond the walls of her home. Ethan's safety and her own hope for their future depended on it. The morning after Lily handed over the evidence to her school counselor, Mrs. Elliott, a new wave of uncertainty swept through the household. Lily sat at the breakfast table with Ethan, their usual silence now laced with anticipation. She had been assured by Mrs. Elliott that the authorities would act, but the question of when and how lingered heavily. Ethan's eyes darted nervously toward the kitchen where Mrs. Harper stood, humming to herself as if the storm Lily had set in motion wasn't about to come crashing down. By late afternoon, the sound of a firm knock on the door startled everyone. Lily and Ethan exchanged a glance before their father, Mr. Scott, shuffled to answer it. Standing on the porch were two uniformed police officers, accompanied by a social worker carrying a clipboard. The weight of their presence seemed to suck the air out of the room. "Mr. Scott," one officer began, "we're here to investigate allegations of child abuse in your household. We need to speak with everyone." Mrs. Harper emerged from the kitchen, her smile frozen on her face. "What is this nonsense?" she demanded, her voice sharp and defensive. The officers explained the situation calmly, their professionalism unshaken by her growing hostility. They separated the family into different rooms for questioning. Lily and Ethan sat with the social worker in the living room. "Can you tell me what's been happening?" the social worker asked gently. Her kind eyes focused on Ethan. Lily took the lead, her voice steady despite the lump in her throat. "Mrs. Harper has been hurting Ethan," she said, handing over her tablet. "I recorded some of it. She makes him do all the chores, calls him horrible names, and she hits him." Ethan nodded, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's true," he said. "I try to stay out of her way, but nothing I did was ever good enough." Meanwhile, in another room, Mrs. Harper vehemently denied the accusations. "This is ridiculous," she hissed. "I've only ever been strict because I care about them. Discipline isn't abuse." But the evidence on Lily's tablet painted a starkly different picture. The officers weren't swayed by Mrs. Harper's deflections. The recordings were clear and damning, capturing her harsh words and physical aggression. When the interviews were over, the police informed Mr. Scott that Mrs. Harper would need to leave the home immediately while the investigation continued. As the officers escorted Mrs. Harper out, her eyes locked onto Lily. "You think you've won," she hissed. "You'll regret this." Lily stood firm, her hands trembling, but her gaze unwavering. For the first time, the weight of Mrs. Harper's presence lifted from the house, leaving a stillness that felt both unsettling and liberating. The days that followed were filled with tension and quiet reflection. Mr. Scott spent hours in his study, his guilt weighing heavily on him. Ethan, though free from Mrs. Harper's abuse, was hesitant to relax, his movements still cautious, as if expecting her to return at any moment. Lily stayed close to him, offering quiet reassurances whenever she could. One evening, Mr. Scott called both children into the living room. He sat on the couch, his face pale and shadowed with exhaustion. For a long moment, he simply looked at them, his hands clasped tightly. "I owe you both an apology," he began, his voice trembling. "I should have seen what was happening. I should have protected you." Ethan shifted uncomfortably, his eyes fixed on the floor. "I thought you didn't care," he murmured, the pain in his voice cutting through the room. Mr. Scott's expression crumpled. "I care more than I can ever explain," he said, his voice breaking. "I let my love for Harper blind me. I wanted to believe she was helping, not hurting. But I was wrong, and I failed you. I'm so sorry." Lily crossed her arms, her voice firm but not unkind. "Words are good, Dad, but Ethan needs to feel safe." "We all do." Mr. Scott nodded, his jaw tightening with resolve. "You're right. I've already arranged for us to start family counseling. We're going to heal from this together." For the first time in weeks, Lily felt a flicker of hope. She glanced at Ethan, who offered a small, hesitant smile. It wasn't much, but it was a start. The family's first counseling session was awkward and quiet. They sat in a cozy office filled with bookshelves and soft lighting, the air heavy with unspoken tension. Dr. Price, their counselor, greeted them warmly, her presence calm and reassuring. "I understand this family has been through a lot," she said, her voice gentle. "Healing won't happen overnight, but this is the first step." She invited each of them to share their thoughts, starting with Mr. Scott. He sighed deeply, his shoulders slumping. "I ignored things I should have seen," he admitted. "I let Ethan down, and I let Lily carry a burden that no child should have to bear. I'm ashamed of that, and I'm committed to making things right." Ethan hesitated before speaking, his voice barely audible. "I thought you didn't believe me," he said. "I thought I was alone." "You're not alone, Ethan," Mr. Scott said earnestly. "I see that now, and I'll spend the rest of my life proving to you that you're loved and valued." Lily watched the exchange, her heart aching for both of them. "We're here now," she added softly. "That means we're trying." By the end of the session, there was a sense of hopefulness in the air. Dr. Price praised their courage and reminded them that rebuilding trust was a journey, not a destination. As they left the office, Ethan glanced at Lily and smiled faintly. The shadows in his eyes seemed to lift, if only slightly. Over the next few months, the household began to heal. Without Mrs. Harper's toxic presence, the tension in the air dissipated, replaced by a cautious optimism. Family meals were no longer filled with dread, but with laughter and conversation. Mr. Scott made a conscious effort to be present, helping Ethan with his homework and taking an active interest in Lily's school projects. Ethan began to thrive, his once shy demeanor giving way to a quiet confidence. He joined the school's art club, finding joy in sketching and painting. Lily watched him with pride, knowing that his growth was a testament to their family's resilience. One evening, as they sat around the dining table, Ethan spoke up unexpectedly. "I just wanted to say thank you," he said, his voice steady, "for everything you did for me. Lily, I don't know where I'd be without you." Lily smiled, her heart swelling with emotion. "We're family, Ethan. That's what we do." Mr. Scott reached across the table, placing a hand on each of their shoulders. "You two are the most important people in my life," he said. "I'll never take that for granted again." The journey to healing hadn't been easy, and the scars of the past might never fully fade. But together, they had broken the silence that once divided them. In its place was a bond strengthened by love, empathy, and the determination to never let darkness take hold again. As Lily and Ethan cleared the table that night, she glanced at her stepbrother and smiled. They had found their strength in unity, and no one could take that away. Thank you for joining us on this powerful journey of courage, empathy, and transformation. Lily's unwavering determination to protect her brother reminds us that even in the face of overwhelming adversity, love and resilience can bring about profound change. If this story touched your heart, please like, share, and subscribe to Empathy Stories for more inspiring narratives. Together, let's spread the message of compassion and hope to create a kinder world.